I'm excited to welcome you to my channel. Before I dive into my story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The lakeside cabin where I spend my summer breaks is the kind of place that seems untouched by time, a small slice of serenity nestled deep in the woods. The cabin itself is modest, a simple structure made of weathered wood, with a sloping roof and a stone chimney that rises up like a sentinel against the sky. It's the kind of place that invites you to slow down, to breathe a little easier, and to forget about the world beyond the trees. Surrounded by a thick blanket of pine and oak, the cabin sits just a few steps from the water's edge. The lake is vast, its surface usually so calm that it reflects the sky like a mirror, capturing every wisp of cloud and every shade of blue. In the early mornings, when the sun is just beginning to rise, a thin mist clings to the water, giving the entire scene an ethereal quality. The only sounds are the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore, the distant call of a loon, and the rustling of leaves as a light breeze moves through the trees. The air here is different, too, crisper, cleaner, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. It's a world away from the noise and chaos of everyday life, a place where time seems to stretch out endlessly, and the pressures of school, work, and everything else just melt away. The cabin doesn't have much in the way of modern conveniences, no Wi-Fi, no TV, and just a small radio that crackles with static more often than not, but that's part of the charm. It's a place to disconnect, to get lost in the simplicity of the moment. Fishing has always been my favorite way to pass the time here. There's something about being out on the water that brings a sense of peace I can't find anywhere else. I usually head out early, just as the first light of dawn begins to break over the treetops. I'll grab my rod and tackle box, slide the old rowboat into the water, and push off from the shore. The lake is usually still, the water so smooth that it feels like I'm gliding across glass. Out on the lake, the world seems to shrink down to just me, the boat, and the water. I'll drop my line and settle in, letting the quiet surround me as I wait for that familiar tug that signals a bite. Sometimes, I'll drift for hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky as I lose track of time. There's no rush, no pressure to do anything but be in the moment, to enjoy the solitude and the rhythm of the water against the hull. Fishing has always been more than just a pastime for me. It's a way to connect with something deeper, something primal. There's a certain satisfaction in the patience it requires, and the stillness that comes with waiting. The world around me fades away, and all that matters is the line in the water, the anticipation of what might come next. Whether I catch anything or not is almost beside the point. It's the act itself, the quiet focus, that brings a sense of clarity and calm. The lake has a way of making everything else feel distant, almost irrelevant. The stress of daily life, the noise and demands of the world, they all seem to vanish the moment I push off from the shore. Out here, it's just me and nature, the gentle pull of the current, the play of light on the water. It's a kind of therapy, a way to reset and recharge, to remember what it feels like to simply exist without the weight of expectations or obligations. Even as the day progresses and the sun begins to dip toward the horizon, the sense of peace remains. The sky transforms into a canvas of reds, oranges, and purples, reflecting off the water in a breathtaking display. It's a moment that never fails to leave me in awe, a reminder of the beauty that exists in the world if you just take the time to look for it. And as I row back to shore, the evening air cooling around me, I always feel a deep sense of contentment, knowing that I've found something here that can't be replicated anywhere else. The cabin by the lake is more than just a summer retreat, it's a refuge, a place where I can escape the pressures of the outside world and reconnect with myself. And out on the water, with a fishing rod in hand and the vast expanse of the lake before me, I find a kind of tranquility that's become increasingly rare in my life. It's a place where I can breathe, where I can be at peace, and where, for a few precious weeks each year, I can forget about everything else and just enjoy the simple, quiet moments that make life worth living. It was a clear, warm morning, the kind that made the lake seem even more inviting than usual. The sky was a brilliant blue, not a cloud in sight, and the air was filled with the sounds of summer, the hum of insects, the occasional call of a bird, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was the perfect day for fishing, and I set out early, eager to spend a few quiet hours on the water. I rowed out to my favorite spot, a little cove tucked away from the main body of the lake, where the water was calm and the fish were usually plentiful. The boat glided smoothly over the glassy surface, and I felt that familiar sense of peace settle over me as I dropped my line into the water and leaned back, letting the tranquility of the lake surround me. The morning passed in a comfortable rhythm, the sun climbing higher in the sky as I reeled in a few small catches, nothing remarkable, but satisfying nonetheless. The world seemed to narrow down to the gentle rocking of the boat, the quiet splash of the water, and the occasional tug on the line. It was just me, the lake, and the endless stretch of time that summer mornings always seemed to hold. But then, something changed. It started with a slight ripple in the water, just at the edge of my vision. It wasn't unusual for the lake to stir with small movements, fish breaking the surface, a breeze brushing across the water, but this ripple was different. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was something about it that caught my attention. It seemed to move with a purpose, a slow, deliberate motion that didn't match the usual patterns of the lake. I squinted at the water, trying to follow the ripple as it made its way toward the boat. For a moment, I thought I saw something dark beneath the surface, a shadow that seemed to glide just below the ripples. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, leaving nothing but the calm, placid water in its wake. I shook my head, chuckling softly to myself. It was probably just a trick of the light, or maybe a large fish swimming close to the surface. I'd seen plenty of strange things out on the lake over the years, reflections that looked like shapes, currents that made the water move in unexpected ways. It was easy for the mind to play tricks on you when you were out here alone, surrounded by nothing but water and sky. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about this ripple, something that didn't quite fit. But I pushed the thought aside, telling myself not to let my imagination get the better of me. After all, this was the same lake I'd fished on every summer, the same peaceful retreat that had always brought me a sense of calm. There was no reason to think that today would be any different. I cast my line again, focusing on the familiar motions of fishing, the way the rod felt in my hands, the slight tension on the line as I reeled it in. But as the minutes passed, I noticed something else that struck me as odd. The fish seemed to have disappeared. The lake, usually teeming with life, had gone strangely quiet. My line hung slack in the water, untouched, and there were no more ripples, no signs of movement beneath the surface. I frowned, glancing around the cove. It wasn't unusual for the fish to be less active during certain times of the day, especially when the sun was high and the water warmed. But this felt different. It was as if the lake itself had gone still, as if all the life beneath the surface had simply vanished. For a moment, a flicker of unease passed through me. I found myself staring at the water, searching for any sign of movement, any hint that the lake was still alive. But there was nothing, just the silent, glassy surface, stretching out around me like a mirror reflecting the cloudless sky. I shook my head again, trying to brush off the growing sense of unease. It was probably just a coincidence, I told myself. Maybe the fish had moved to a different part of the lake, or maybe they were just resting, hidden in the cooler depths where I couldn't reach them. There was no need to overthink it. And yet, as I sat there in the boat, my line dangling uselessly in the water, I couldn't help but feel that something was off. The peacefulness of the lake, which had always been a source of comfort, now felt strangely oppressive, as if the calm had taken on a different quality, a stillness that was too perfect, too absolute. But I wasn't ready to let a few strange ripples and a quiet morning ruin my time on the lake. I had come out here to fish, to enjoy the solitude, and I wasn't going to let my imagination get in the way of that. So I forced myself to relax, leaning back in the boat and closing my eyes, listening to the gentle sounds of the water lapping against the hull. After a while, the tension began to fade, and I convinced myself that it was all in my head. The lake was just as it always had been, peaceful, serene, a place where I could escape from the world. Whatever I thought I'd seen, whatever strange feeling had come over me, it didn't matter. It was just another day on the water, and I wasn't going to let anything spoil that. But even as I told myself those things, a part of me couldn't forget the oddity of it all, the strange ripple, the sudden stillness, the way the fish had vanished without a trace. It lingered at the back of my mind, a small but persistent doubt that I couldn't quite shake. I didn't know it yet, But that was the moment when the lake began to change for me, when the place I had always loved started to take on a different, darker hue. And as much as I tried to dismiss it, to push the thought away, something deep inside me knew that I had just glimpsed the first hint of a mystery far more unsettling than I could have imagined. It was one of those late summer evenings where the sky bleeds into shades of deep orange and purple, the kind of evening that always made the lake feel like it was caught between day and night. The air was warm, with a slight chill creeping in as the sun dipped closer to the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. I had been fishing since late afternoon, enjoying the quiet and the slow, steady rhythm of the lake, but as the day waned, something about the atmosphere started to change. I hadn't planned on staying out so late, but the calm of the evening had lulled me into a kind of trance. The water was so still, it looked like glass, reflecting the colors of the sky in a way that made it seem like I was floating between two worlds. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves from the trees lining the shore and the soft plop of the fishing line as it hit the water, but otherwise, the world was silent, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. As the light began to fade, a strange feeling settled over me, like a weight pressing down on my chest. It was subtle at first, just a vague sense of unease that made me shift in my seat and glance around the water's surface more often than usual. The air seemed to grow colder, the shadows on the lake stretching out longer, darker. I tried to focus on the fishing rod in my hands, on the line drifting lazily in the water, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I was no longer alone. It was then that I noticed something, just a small ripple at first, barely more than a disturbance in the glassy surface of the lake. I squinted, trying to make out what had caused it, but the water was still again, reflecting the dimming sky above. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area around the boat, searching for any sign of movement. For a moment, everything was quiet, and I began to wonder if it had just been a fish, perhaps, or a piece of driftwood disturbed by the current. But then I saw it, a dark shape moving just beneath the surface, almost directly below the boat. It was large, much larger than any fish I'd ever seen in the lake, and it moved with a slow, deliberate grace, like a predator stalking its prey. The water was too dark to make out any details, but I could feel its presence, something cold and ancient that sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched the shape glide beneath the boat. It didn't move like a fish, didn't have the quick, darting motions of the trout and bass I was used to. Instead, it seemed to drift, almost as if it were observing me, studying the boat as it circled slowly in the water. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to row back to shore, but I was paralyzed by a fear that I couldn't fully understand. There was something wrong about this. The lake had always been a place of peace for me, a refuge where I could escape the world and lose myself in the simple act of fishing. But now, as the darkness deepened and the shadows stretched out across the water, it felt different, alien, hostile. I could feel the eyes of the creature below on me, could sense its awareness, and the thought that something inhuman was watching me sent a wave of terror through my body. Finally, the spell broke, and I snapped into action. My hands were trembling as I yanked the fishing line out of the water, not caring that it got tangled in the rod. I turned toward the oars, fumbling with them as I tried to get the boat moving. The water, once so calm and inviting, now felt like a trap, something that held me in place while the thing below closed in. I couldn't see the shape anymore, but I could still feel it, that oppressive presence lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. My heart raced as I rowed toward the shore, the boat cutting through the water with a speed born of desperation. Every splash of the oars felt too loud, echoing across the lake like a beacon for whatever was out there. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, expecting to see the dark shape rising up from the depths, but the water remained still, the surface unbroken except for the ripples left in my wake. By the time I reached the shore, the sun had nearly set, the last of the light fading into a deep, bruised purple that made the trees look like black silhouettes against the sky. I jumped out of the boat as soon as it hit the shallows, dragging it up onto the beach with shaking hands. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The lake was quiet again, the water calm and undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the next time I ventured out onto the water. I stood on the shore for a long moment, staring out at the lake as the darkness settled in around me, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I had just imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There had been something in the water, something that shouldn't have been there, and it had been watching me. The thought sent a chill down my spine, and I found myself backing away from the water, my eyes scanning the surface for any sign of movement. I didn't want to turn my back on the lake, didn't want to give it the chance to catch me off guard. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and drew the curtains, shutting out the sight of the lake. But even then, the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The lake, once a place of peace and solace, now felt like a threat, a dark, unknowable presence that had marked me in some way. I couldn't explain it, couldn't put into words the sense of unease that had taken hold of me, but I knew that things were different now. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the cabin creaking in the wind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark shape moving beneath the water, felt the cold, watchful gaze of whatever had been lurking below. The memory of it sent waves of anxiety through me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that whatever was in the lake had noticed me, and it wasn't going to let me go so easily. As the hours dragged on, I found myself wondering what else might be out there, hidden beneath the surface of the lake. The thought was too terrifying to dwell on, but it kept coming back, a persistent whisper in the back of my mind. And no matter how hard I tried to push it away, I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, of something ancient and malevolent lurking just out of sight, waiting for the next time I let my guard down. A few days after the unsettling experience on the lake, I found myself restless, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The cabin, which had always been a place of comfort and peace, now felt almost claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in on me. I couldn't stop thinking about that dark shape beneath the water, the sense of being watched, and the way the lake itself seemed to have changed overnight. It was late in the afternoon, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. I was pacing around the small living room, my mind racing, when my eyes landed on the narrow staircase leading up to the attic. I'd rarely gone up there, just a cramped, dusty space filled with old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and the remnants of summers long past. But today, something compelled me to climb those creaky wooden steps, as if I might find some kind of answer hidden in the attic's dim, cobwebbed corners. The attic was just as I remembered it, musty and filled with the smell of aged wood and dust. The only light came from a small, dirty window on the far wall, casting everything in a dull, amber glow. I made my way through the clutter, carefully stepping over old trunks and stacks of yellowing newspapers, until I reached a corner where a few forgotten boxes were piled haphazardly. It was there, buried beneath a heap of old blankets and a broken lantern, that I found it, an old, weathered journal. The leather cover was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age. It looked like it had been left untouched for decades, the kind of thing someone might have used and then forgotten about as life moved on. Something about it called to me, though, and I reached out, hesitating only for a moment before picking it up. The journal was surprisingly heavy, the pages thick and brittle under my fingers as I carefully opened it. The handwriting inside was neat but faded, the ink a dull brown that had bled slightly into the paper over time. I could just make out the name scrawled on the inside cover, Walter Green. I didn't recognize the name, but a quick glance through the first few pages revealed that Walter had once lived in this very cabin, many years ago, long before it had passed down to my grandparents. As I flipped through the pages, I realized that this wasn't just an ordinary journal. It was more like a chronicle, a detailed account of Walter's time at the lake, written in a careful, deliberate style that suggested he had been documenting something important. The first few entries were mundane enough, notes about the weather, fishing trips, repairs he'd made to the cabin, but as I read on, the tone began to shift. It started with small things, mentions of strange noises at night, the feeling of being watched while out on the lake, and a few odd encounters with the local wildlife. Walter wrote about a day when the fish had suddenly vanished, just as they had for me, leaving the lake eerily still. He described how he'd felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface, watching him, waiting. My heart skipped a beat as I read these passages, the words echoing my own recent experiences so closely that it was as if Walter had been writing about my own time at the lake. The more I read, the more my curiosity grew, but so did a creeping sense of dread. It was like reading a ghost story, only this one wasn't a work of fiction, it was real, and it was happening to me. Walter's entries became darker, more frantic as time went on. He wrote about seeing shapes in the water, much like the one I had seen, and how they seemed to follow him whenever he went out on the lake. He described them as large, shadowy figures that moved with an unnatural grace, their presence filling him with a primal fear he couldn't explain. He wrote about hearing whispers in the dead of night, voices that seemed to rise up from the water, calling his name, urging him to come closer. But the most disturbing entries were the ones where Walter spoke of disappearances. He mentioned several people who had gone missing over the years, locals, fishermen, even a few travelers passing through. Their boats were often found drifting aimlessly on the lake, their occupants nowhere to be seen. In one particularly chilling entry, Walter recounted the disappearance of a friend who had come to visit him at the cabin. They had gone out on the lake together, but only Walter had returned. His friend's body was never found. As I read these words, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The story was beginning to feel all too familiar, the parallels to my own experiences impossible to ignore. I had come to the lake seeking peace and solitude, but now I was starting to wonder if I had stumbled into something far darker, something that had been lying in wait for years. The last few entries in the journal were the most disturbing of all. Walter's handwriting had grown erratic, the neat script devolving into jagged, hurried lines that spoke of a man on the edge of sanity. He wrote about a creature, a thing in the lake that he had seen with his own eyes, a monstrous being that defied description. He described its eyes, cold and black, like the depths of the lake itself, and how they had locked onto him, filling him with a terror unlike anything he had ever known. Walter wrote about how the creature had started to haunt his dreams, how he could feel its presence even when he was far from the water. He became convinced that it was coming for him, that it wouldn't stop until it had claimed him just as it had claimed so many others. His final entry was little more than a desperate scrawl, a plea for anyone who found the journal to leave the lake and never return. My hands were trembling by the time I finished reading. The journal slipped from my fingers, landing on the floor with a soft thud as I stared blankly at the dust-covered boards. The cabin was silent around me, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves outside the attic window, but I felt anything but safe. The sense of dread that had been building inside me for days now threatened to overwhelm me, the weight of Walter's words pressing down on my chest like a leaden hand. I wanted to believe that it was just a story, the ramblings of a man who had spent too much time alone in the woods, but I knew better. I had seen the shape in the water, felt the eyes of the creature watching me, just as Walter had. And now that I knew what it was capable of, the thought of going back out onto the lake filled me with a fear that was almost paralyzing. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the curiosity that had taken hold of me. I needed to know more, to understand what was happening here, even if it meant facing the very thing that had driven Walter to madness. The lake was no longer just a peaceful retreat, it was a place of danger, of dark secrets that had been hidden for far too long. And now that I had found Walter's journal, those secrets were beginning to unravel, pulling me deeper into a mystery that I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. As I stood there in the attic, the journal lying at my feet, I knew that my time at the lake would never be the same. The peaceful days of fishing and quiet reflection were over, replaced by a growing sense of fear and unease that I couldn't ignore. The lake had changed, and so had I. And as much as I wanted to leave, to escape the dark presence that seemed to be closing in around me, I knew that I couldn't. Not yet. There were still too many questions left unanswered, too many mysteries hidden beneath the surface of the water. And no matter how much I feared what I might find, I knew that I had to keep searching, to uncover the truth before it was too late. Because deep down, I had a sinking feeling that whatever was in the lake wasn't done with me yet. The storm came in suddenly, like an uninvited guest who forces their way through the door before you even realize they're there. One moment, the evening was calm and quiet, with the last light of the sun casting a golden glow across the lake. The next, dark clouds had rolled in from the west, swallowing up the sky and plunging the world into a premature night. The wind picked up, rattling the branches of the trees and sending waves rippling across the surface of the water. It was as if the lake itself was stirring, reacting to the storm's arrival with a kind of restless energy that set my nerves on edge. I had been outside, tidying up around the cabin when the first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the wooden deck. Within minutes, the light drizzle had turned into a torrential downpour, the kind of rain that slams into the earth with a force that makes the ground tremble. I hurried inside, shutting the door just as the wind picked up, howling through the trees with a ferocity that made the cabin creak and groan as if it were alive. The storm was unlike any I'd experienced before. The wind battered the cabin from all sides, whipping the rain against the windows so hard that I was sure the glass would shatter. The sky outside was a constant flicker of lightning, each flash illuminating the world in stark, eerie white before plunging it back into darkness. Thunder rumbled overhead, so loud that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin, making the floorboards tremble beneath my feet. I stood in the middle of the living room, feeling small and vulnerable as the storm raged outside. The sense of unease that had been growing since I found Walter's journal was now a full-blown fear, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The cabin felt less like a sanctuary and more like a flimsy shelter, barely able to hold back the fury of the storm, and whatever else might be out there in the dark. I tried to distract myself by lighting a fire in the old stone hearth, the crackle of the flames a small comfort against the howling wind. But as the minutes ticked by, the storm only seemed to grow more intense, the wind screaming around the cabin like a living thing, the rain pounding against the roof in a deafening roar. The world outside had become a swirling maelstrom of shadows and noise, and the cabin seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in as the storm raged on. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a high-pitched whine that cut through the roar of the storm. But as I listened closer, I realized that it was something else entirely, something far more unsettling. It was a low, moaning sound, almost like a voice, rising and falling in a strange, haunting melody that sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to hear over the noise of the storm. The sound was coming from the direction of the lake, carried on the wind like a whisper from some far-off place. It was faint, almost drowned out by the storm, but there was something about it that filled me with an instinctual terror, a feeling that I was hearing something that wasn't meant for human ears. The moaning grew louder, more distinct, until it was unmistakable. It wasn't the wind, or the trees, or anything natural, it was something else, something that seemed to be calling out from the depths of the lake itself. The sound was eerie, almost otherworldly, and it carried with it a sense of ancient, unknowable power. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as I realized that the moaning wasn't just noise, it was a voice. A voice that was calling out from the lake, its tone filled with a kind of mournful, desperate longing that made my blood run cold. I had no idea what it was saying, couldn't understand the words, but the intent was clear, it wanted something. And whatever it was getting closer. I backed away from the window, my eyes fixed on the dark, storm-tossed water outside. The wind was blowing so hard that the trees were bent almost double, their branches thrashing against the cabin like claws. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the world into a blur of shadows and flickering light. But through it all, I could still hear that voice, rising above the storm, growing louder with each passing moment. Then I saw them, the shadows. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the lightning, the way the flash illuminated the trees and the water in strange, sharp relief. But as I watched, I realized that the shadows were moving, shifting in the darkness outside the cabin. They weren't being cast by the trees or the waves, they were something else entirely, something that moved with a life of its own. The shadows swirled and twisted, their forms indistinct, like wisps of smoke caught in the wind. They gathered at the edge of the lake, just beyond the reach of the cabin's porch light, their movements fluid and unnatural. I could feel their presence, a cold, malevolent energy that seemed to seep through the walls, filling the cabin with a sense of dread that was almost suffocating. As the shadows danced in the darkness, the moaning voice grew louder, more insistent, as if it were urging them on. The shadows began to move closer to the cabin, their forms elongating and stretching as they slithered across the ground like snakes. I watched in horror as they reached the edge of the porch, their dark tendrils creeping up the steps, curling around the railings, and sliding along the walls. Panic seized me, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I stumbled back from the window. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows across the room as if it, too, were reacting to the presence outside. I could hear the shadows now, a faint rustling sound like dry leaves being dragged across the ground. The voice from the lake had grown into a wailing chorus, a cacophony of sounds that filled my head with a rising tide of terror. I had to get out. The thought struck me with sudden, desperate clarity. I couldn't stay in the cabin, not with those things outside. But the storm was raging, the wind howling so fiercely that it felt like it would tear the roof off at any moment. The only place to run was the lake itself, but the idea of going anywhere near that dark, churning water made my stomach twist with fear. I grabbed the lantern from the mantel, my hand shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. The light inside flickered uncertainly as I fumbled with the wick, trying to get it to burn brighter. I needed more light, something to keep the shadows at bay, to push back the darkness that was closing in around me. But even as the lantern's light grew steadier, I knew it wouldn't be enough. The shadows were relentless, their forms pressing against the windows, wrapping around the corners of the cabin, seeping through the cracks in the walls. I could feel the cold, damp air that they carried with them, a chill that cut through the warmth of the fire and settled deep in my bones. The voice outside was deafening now, a constant, droning wail that seemed to reverberate through the cabin itself. The walls trembled with each gust of wind, the windows rattling in their frames as if they might shatter at any moment. The shadows had completely surrounded the cabin, their dark forms writhing and undulating as they tried to find a way in. I felt trapped, cornered by forces I couldn't understand, forces that seemed to be drawing me closer to the lake with each passing moment. The terror was overwhelming, a cold, suffocating fear that threatened to paralyze me where I stood. But I couldn't give in to it, couldn't let the shadows take me. I had to fight, had to find a way to survive, even as the storm raged on outside. With a final, desperate burst of resolve, I backed away from the windows, keeping the lantern held high as I moved toward the center of the room. I needed to stay away from the walls, away from the shadows that were pressing in from all sides. The fire in the hearth flared up suddenly, casting the room in a bright, warm glow that momentarily pushed back the darkness. But the reprieve was brief. The storm outside seemed to redouble its efforts, the wind howling like a living thing, the rain slamming against the windows with a force that made the glass bow inward. The shadows outside the cabin twisted and surged, their forms contorting as they tried to break through the light. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm seemed to reach its peak. The wind let out a final, deafening roar, the thunder crashed overhead like the world was splitting in two, and the shadows outside the cabin froze, their dark forms suspended in the air like black smoke. For a moment, everything was still. The voice from the lake had gone silent, the wailing cut off abruptly as if it had been snatched away by the wind. The cabin was eerily quiet, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth, the flames dancing in the grate as if nothing had happened. I stood there, the lantern held tight in my hands, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps as I waited for something to happen. The fear that had gripped me so tightly was still there, a cold knot in my chest, but it was tempered now by a strange, uneasy calm. It was as if the storm had reached its climax and then suddenly decided to withdraw, leaving me alone in the aftermath. But I knew it wasn't over. The shadows hadn't disappeared, they were still out there, lurking just beyond the edges of the firelight. I could feel their presence, could sense them waiting, watching, biding their time until the storm returned, and they could make their move. The night dragged on, the minutes feeling like hours as I sat by the fire, the lantern burning low beside me. The storm had subsided to a steady rain, the wind now a low, mournful howl that whispered around the cabin like a distant echo of the chaos that had come before. The shadows outside had retreated, their dark forms melting back into the night, but the memory of them lingered, a haunting reminder of the terror I had faced. As dawn finally broke, the first light of day creeping over the horizon, I felt a profound sense of relief. The storm had passed, the lake was calm once more, but I knew that something had changed. The shadows were real, the voice from the lake was real, and whatever forces had been unleashed that night were still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was no longer just a place of peace and solitude. It had become something else, something dark and dangerous, a place where ancient, malevolent forces dwelled just beneath the surface, ready to rise up and claim their next victim. And as I sat there, staring into the dying embers of the fire, I knew that I would never be able to look at the lake in the same way again. The shadows had marked me, the voice from the lake had called out to me, and now, no matter where I went, I would always carry a piece of that darkness with me. It was just past midnight when I finally came face to face with the creature from the lake. The events of the past few weeks had left me shaken and exhausted, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror that awaited me that night. I hadn't planned on going near the lake again, not after what had happened during the storm. But something compelled me, a force I couldn't quite understand, as if the lake itself was calling to me, demanding my presence. I resisted at first, trying to convince myself to stay inside the cabin where it was safe, but the pull was too strong. It was as if an invisible hand was guiding me, drawing me closer to the water with each passing minute. The night was eerily quiet as I stepped outside, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly light over the landscape, making the trees and rocks appear sharp and unnatural. The lake was a black mirror, still and silent, as if it were waiting for something. I found myself walking toward the shoreline, my footsteps almost soundless on the damp ground. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run as far from the water as possible. But I couldn't stop. I was no longer in control, no longer able to fight the compulsion that gripped me. When I reached the edge of the lake, I stopped, staring out at the dark expanse of water. For a moment, nothing happened. The surface remained unbroken, the night still and calm. I felt a flicker of relief, a small hope that maybe it had all been in my head, that the journal had just been the ravings of a man driven mad by isolation. But then I saw it. A ripple spread across the water, starting at the center of the lake and moving outward in slow, deliberate waves. My breath caught in my throat as I watched, frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the disturbance. The ripple grew larger, more violent, until the surface of the lake began to churn and bubble as if something massive was rising from the depths. And then it appeared. The creature broke through the water with a force that sent a spray of icy droplets flying into the air. It was enormous, towering over the shoreline, its body a grotesque amalgamation of twisted flesh and metal. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly greenish-black, covered in patches of rusted metal plates and barnacle-like growths. Long, sinewy limbs ended in webbed claws that raked the surface of the lake as it dragged itself closer to the shore. But it was the creature's face that truly horrified me. Its head was massive, with a wide, gaping mouth filled with jagged, broken teeth that dripped with a thick, oily substance. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were two deep, hollow sockets, glowing with a dim, malevolent light that seemed to pierce through me, reaching into the very depths of my soul. The head itself seemed an unnatural blend of something biological and mechanical, as though it had been pieced together from the wreckage of the lake. It let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that reverberated through the ground beneath my feet, shaking the very air around me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, trapped in place by an overwhelming fear that gripped me so tightly I could barely breathe. All I could do was watch in helpless terror as the creature drew closer, its monstrous form illuminated by the pale light of the moon. Time seemed to stretch out, each second an eternity as the creature reached the shore, its massive claws digging into the muddy earth with a sickening squelch. It reared up to its full height, towering over me like a living nightmare, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I could feel its breath, hot and rancid, as it exhaled in long, wheezing gusts that reeked of decay and salt water. I knew in that moment that this was the creature Walter had written about in his journal, the same thing that had haunted his every waking moment, driving him to the brink of madness. The legends were true. The monster from the lake was real, and now it was here, standing just a few feet away from me, close enough that I could see the glistening strands of slime that dripped from its body, hear the grinding of metal and bone as it moved. Desperation surged through me, cutting through the paralysis that had held me in place. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it take me. With a burst of adrenaline, I turned and bolted back toward the cabin, my feet slipping and sliding in the mud as I scrambled to escape. The creature let out a deafening roar, a sound that echoed across the lake and shook the trees, but I didn't dare look back. I could feel it behind me, its presence like a shadow that threatened to swallow me whole. The cabin was just ahead, the door still ajar from when I'd left in my trance-like state. I reached it in what felt like a single, frantic leap, throwing myself inside and slamming the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled with the lock, my fingers slick with sweat, but I managed to bolt it just as something heavy crashed against the door, making it shudder on its hinges. I stumbled back, breathing hard, my eyes wide with terror as I stared at the door, half expecting it to splinter under the force of the creature's attack. But it held, and the cabin remained intact, the only sound the frantic pounding of my heart in my ears. Outside, the creature let out another roar, this one filled with a frustration that was almost human, but it didn't try to break down the door again. Instead, I heard the heavy, wet thud of its footsteps as it moved away, back toward the lake. It took several minutes for me to regain my composure, but even then, the fear didn't dissipate. It lingered, a cold, gnawing dread that settled deep in my bones. I had seen it. The creature from the lake was real, and I had barely escaped with my life. The journal's warnings, once so easy to dismiss as the ravings of a madman, now echoed in my mind with a terrifying clarity. Walter had known the truth. He had faced the same horror, and it had driven him to the brink of insanity. And now, it was after me. As I sat there, trembling in the dark, I realized that I could no longer stay at the cabin. The lake was no longer a place of peace and solitude, it was a place of nightmares, haunted by a creature that defied all reason and logic. I had to leave, had to get as far away as possible before it came for me again. But even as I made plans to escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature had marked me somehow, that it would follow me wherever I went. The lake's dark secrets had been revealed, and there was no going back. The creature was real, and it was hunting me. And no matter how far I ran, I knew it would find me again. After that horrifying encounter with the creature from the lake, my life at the cabin changed completely. The place that had once been my sanctuary was now a prison, a battleground where I was desperately trying to defend myself against something far beyond my understanding. The memory of the creature, its grotesque appearance, its monstrous roar, and the cold, dead eyes that had locked onto mine, haunted me constantly. I knew it was only a matter of time before it returned, and I couldn't afford to be caught unprepared again. The first thing I did was try to fortify the cabin. I boarded up the windows with whatever scrap wood I could find, nailing the planks in place until the windows were nearly impenetrable. I reinforced the doors, adding extra locks and bracing them with heavy furniture. Every entrance had to be secured, every potential weakness fortified. I knew deep down that the cabin wouldn't hold if the creature really wanted to get in, but I had to try. It was all I could do to keep the terror at bay. Next, I started setting traps around the perimeter of the cabin. I had no idea what kind of traps would work on a creature like the one I'd seen, but I figured that anything was better than nothing. I dug shallow pits and lined them with sharp sticks, covered with leaves and branches to conceal them. I rigged up crude tripwires made from fishing line, hoping they might at least slow the creature down or give me some warning if it approached. I even scattered salt around the cabin, recalling some vague folklore about salt repelling evil. It wasn't much, but it was something, a way to feel like I had some control over the situation. The days after the encounter blurred together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I barely slept, my nerves too frayed to allow for rest. Every noise, every creak of the cabin's old timbers, sent a jolt of panic through me. I would spend hours sitting by the fire, the shotgun I'd found in the cabin's attic resting on my lap, listening to the wind outside and waiting for the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the door. I tried to research ways to fend off the creature, searching through old books I found in the attic and scouring the internet for any clue, any hint that might help me. The journal had been a start, but Walter's notes were scattered, incomplete, full of desperation, but lacking in concrete answers. I found myself reading the same entries over and over, searching for something I might have missed, but all I found were more questions. What was this creature? Where had it come from? Why did it seem so intent on haunting this lake, this cabin? And most importantly, how could I stop it? The more I searched for answers, the more hopeless the situation began to feel. The creature was something ancient, something that had existed long before the cabin had been built, before Walter had ever set foot on this land. It was tied to the lake in a way that defied explanation, a malevolent force that had been awakened, or perhaps had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for someone like me to come along. The internet was full of stories, legends about lake monsters and ancient spirits, but nothing concrete. Everything I found was either too vague or too fantastical to be of any real use. There were stories about water spirits, cursed lakes, and creatures that fed on fear, but nothing that gave me a clear path forward. I tried to focus on the practical, ways to defend the cabin, ways to escape if the creature came for me again, but even those efforts felt futile. The toll it took on me, both mentally and physically, was immense. I was constantly on edge, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. My body ached from lack of sleep, my muscles tense and sore from the constant state of alertness. I barely ate, too nauseous from anxiety to keep anything down. My hands shook when I tried to set the traps, when I loaded the shotgun, when I flipped through the pages of Walter's journal, searching for something, anything, that might help me survive. As the days turned into weeks, the sense of hopelessness deepened. I was outmatched, plain and simple. The creature was something beyond human comprehension, something that no amount of preparation could truly defend against. Every time I thought I might be making progress, finding a new piece of folklore, setting up a new trap, I was reminded of how little I actually knew, how little control I had. The creature had come for Walter, and now it was coming for me. The traps, the boarded-up windows, the research, it all felt like a child's attempt to hold back a flood with a sandcastle. The isolation didn't help. Being alone in the cabin, with only my fear and the distant memories of Walter's journal for company, wore me down in ways I hadn't expected. The solitude, once a comfort, now felt like a sentence. The quiet that had once been peaceful was now oppressive, the silence of the lake a constant reminder that something was lurking just out of sight. I began to lose track of time, the days blending into nights, the nights into endless hours of staring out into the darkness, waiting for the creature to return. My mind started to play tricks on me. I would hear things, scratches at the door, the creak of footsteps on the porch, the distant sound of something moving in the water, but when I rushed to the window or the door, there would be nothing. Just the wind, or the sound of a branch brushing against the cabin's exterior. But I knew it wasn't all in my head. The creature was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sleep became impossible. Even when I tried to rest, my mind wouldn't let me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature, its dark, glistening form rising from the lake, its hollow eyes fixed on me, its claws reaching out. I would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, my heart racing as I clutched the shotgun to my chest. I couldn't escape it, not even in my dreams. The worst part was the growing sense that I was losing myself. The fear, the isolation, the constant threat, it was all taking a toll on my sanity. I found myself talking to the cabin, to the traps, to the lake itself, as if they might respond, as if they might offer some kind of reassurance. But there was no response, just the empty silence that pressed in from all sides, a reminder that I was alone. I knew I couldn't go on like this, but I didn't know what else to do. The creature was out there, and it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. I was running out of time, out of options, and the realization that I was powerless to stop it was more terrifying than anything I had ever faced. The cabin, once a refuge, had become a tomb, and I was trapped inside, waiting for the inevitable. Every day that passed brought me closer to the edge, closer to the moment when the creature would return, and I would have to face it once more. And deep down, I knew that no amount of preparation would save me. The creature was too powerful, too ancient, too far beyond anything I could understand. It was only a matter of time before it claimed me, just as it had claimed Walter. But even as the hopelessness grew, there was a small, stubborn part of me that refused to give up. I couldn't just sit here and wait for the end. I had to keep fighting, keep searching for a way out, even if it felt impossible. Because the alternative, the thought of giving in, of letting the creature take me without a fight, was something I couldn't accept. So I kept going, setting traps, reinforcing the cabin, poring over the journal and any other scraps of information I could find. But with every passing day, the fear grew stronger, the sense of doom more palpable. The creature was coming, and I was running out of time. And as the days bled into nights, and the nights into a never-ending darkness, I began to wonder if there was any escape at all, or if the lake had already claimed me, and I was just waiting for it to take me under. The night was deceptively calm, a peaceful silence blanketing the lake as if trying to lull me into a false sense of security. I'd spent weeks on edge, barely sleeping, always listening for any sign that the creature might return. But this night felt different, quieter somehow, as if the very air was holding its breath. I had almost convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, the danger had passed. I was sitting by the fire, its warmth a small comfort against the cool night air, the crackling of the flames the only sound in the cabin. My mind, always alert, began to drift, lulled by the quiet. The shotgun rested on the floor beside me, its cold metal a reassuring presence, but for the first time in days, I felt myself relaxing, just a little. The fear that had gripped me for so long began to loosen its hold. But then, just as I was beginning to feel safe, it happened. A low rumble shook the cabin, so subtle at first that I thought I'd imagined it. I sat up, every nerve suddenly on high alert, my heart pounding in my chest. The rumble grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards, making the walls tremble as if the very earth beneath the cabin was shifting. The fire flickered, the flames dancing wildly as the rumbling intensified, and a cold wave of dread washed over me. Something was out there. Before I could fully process what was happening, a deafening crash reverberated through the night, the impact so powerful it knocked me off my feet. I hit the floor hard, the breath driven from my lungs as the cabin shuddered around me. For a moment, everything was a blur of noise and motion, but then I heard it, a roar, deep and guttural, echoing across the lake like a clap of thunder. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the shotgun with shaking hands, my mind racing with a single, horrifying realization: the creature had returned. Outside, the night had transformed into a scene of chaos. The once calm lake was now a churning, frothing mass of dark water, waves crashing violently against the shore. The trees that lined the water's edge swayed and creaked as if caught in a storm, though there was no wind. And there, rising from the center of the lake, was the creature, its massive form illuminated by the cold light of the moon. It was even more terrifying than I remembered. Water cascaded off its slick, dark body as it emerged from the depths, its long, sinewy limbs ending in webbed claws that dug into the earth as it dragged itself closer to the cabin. Its eyes, cold, black voids, locked onto me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I was frozen in place, staring in horror as it advanced, my grip on the shotgun tightening as I realized just how close it was. The creature moved with a terrifying speed, its claws tearing through the ground as it surged toward me. I raised the shotgun, aiming for its head, and fired. The blast echoed across the lake, the recoil jolting through my arms, but the creature barely flinched. It let out another roar, louder this time, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones, and kept coming. Panic surged through me as I fired again, the shots hitting the creature's chest, driving it back a few steps, but doing little to slow it down. It was too close now, too powerful. I could feel the ground trembling beneath my feet as it charged, its claws swiping at me with deadly precision. I barely had time to react, diving to the side as one of its massive limbs crashed into the spot where I had been standing. I hit the ground hard, the impact sending pain shooting through my side. The shotgun skidded out of my grasp, landing several feet away, and I scrambled to reach it, my heart pounding in my ears. The creature loomed over me, its breath hot and foul as it snarled, ready to strike again. I grabbed the shotgun just as it lunged, raising it in a desperate attempt to defend myself. The creature's claws slammed into the barrel, the force of the blow nearly knocking the weapon from my hands. I fired blindly, the shot hitting its arm, and it recoiled with a pained growl. Seizing the opportunity, I scrambled to my feet, pumping the shotgun and firing again, this time aiming for its head. The blast struck it square in the face, and the creature let out a deafening scream, staggering back, its claws flailing as it tried to regain its balance. I didn't stop. I couldn't. With every ounce of strength I had left, I kept firing, each shot driving the creature further back toward the lake. Its screams echoed across the water, mingling with the roar of the waves, but I didn't let up. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I forced myself to keep going. I had to push it back. I had to survive. Finally, with a final, shuddering roar, the creature began to retreat, its massive body collapsing into the water. I stood there, chest heaving, as it sank beneath the surface, its eyes still locked on mine, filled with a malevolent intelligence that sent a shiver down my spine. The water churned and frothed as it disappeared, leaving only the ripples of its passing. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the spot where the creature had vanished, the shotgun still clutched in my hands. The lake was calm again, the surface smooth and still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The creature might be gone, but the memory of its monstrous form, its terrifying power, would haunt me forever. Slowly, I lowered the shotgun, my arms trembling with exhaustion. The cabin was silent now, the fire burning low, the only sound the distant lapping of water against the shore. I had survived. Somehow, against all odds, I had survived. But as I stood there, alone in the quiet night, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. The lake was no longer a place of peace and solitude. It was a place of nightmares, a place where ancient, malevolent forces lurked just beneath the surface, waiting for their chance to strike. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how long I tried to forget, I knew that the memory of that night, and the creature that had risen from the depths, would stay with me forever. The aftermath of the confrontation with the creature left me in a state of shock, my body and mind reeling from the ordeal. As the adrenaline that had fueled my desperate struggle ebbed away, I became acutely aware of the pain coursing through me. My chest throbbed where the creature's claws had struck, and every breath was a reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. The cabin was eerily silent, the once roaring fire reduced to smoldering embers that cast faint shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, gunpowder, and something else, something damp and rotten that lingered long after the creature had disappeared beneath the lake's surface. The shotgun, now empty and spent, lay on the floor beside me, a useless weight that I no longer had the strength to lift. I slowly pushed myself up, wincing at the sharp pain that shot through my ribs. The cabin, my supposed refuge, was in disarray. Furniture had been knocked over, books and trinkets scattered across the floor, and the front door hung askew on its hinges, nearly torn from the frame during the creature's assault. The walls, once a comforting barrier against the outside world, now felt thin and fragile, as though they could no longer protect me from the horrors lurking just beyond. Staggering to my feet, I made my way to the window, the one I had boarded up in a futile attempt to keep the creature out. The boards were still in place, but they seemed meaningless now, a feeble barrier against the unimaginable force that had threatened my life. I could see the lake through the gaps between the wood, calm, deceptively serene, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The surface might have been still, but beneath it, something dark and ancient remained, waiting. The physical toll of the encounter was evident in every step I took. My body was battered, bruised, and exhausted, each movement a struggle against the pain that radiated through my muscles and bones. My hands shook uncontrollably, not just from the physical exertion but from the lingering fear that had settled deep within me. Every sound, every creak of the cabin, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me, as if the creature might return at any moment. But it was the emotional scars that cut the deepest. The realization that the lake, once my sanctuary, had become a place of nightmares was almost too much to bear. This had been a place where I sought peace, where I could escape the pressures of the world and find solace in the simple act of fishing, in the quiet moments of reflection by the water's edge. But now, the lake was tainted, a source of dread rather than comfort. The memories of the creature's attack, the terror I had felt as it bore down on me, would forever be linked to this place. I had always known that there was something ancient and mysterious about the lake, but I had never imagined it could harbor something so malevolent. Walter's journal had warned me, but I hadn't fully understood until it was too late. The legends, the strange occurrences, the eerie sounds in the night, they were all true. And now, I was living proof of that dark reality. I knew that I couldn't stay here any longer. The cabin, the lake, everything about this place was now a reminder of the terror I had faced. The idea of remaining, of trying to live alongside the memory of what had happened, was unbearable. The creature might have retreated for now, but I knew it wasn't truly gone. It was out there, lurking in the depths, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it returned. As I began to pack my belongings, I was struck by how little I cared about the things I was leaving behind. The fishing gear, the books, the trinkets, all the objects that had once held meaning for me now felt insignificant in the face of what I had experienced. My thoughts were consumed by the need to escape, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the lake. But even as I prepared to leave, I couldn't escape the emotional weight of what had happened. The fear and anxiety that had gripped me during the confrontation still lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's monstrous form rising from the water, its cold, dead eyes locking onto mine. The memory of its claws raking across my chest, the sound of its roar echoing in my ears, it was all too vivid, too real. I knew that these images would haunt me for the rest of my life. As I made my way to the car, the cabin receding behind me, I took one last look at the lake. It was calm, peaceful even, but I knew better. The water was a dark, deceptive mirror, hiding the horrors that lurked beneath. The creature was still out there, somewhere, and the knowledge of that filled me with a deep, abiding sense of unease. I climbed into the car, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. As I started the engine and drove away, the cabin and the lake disappearing in the rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving a part of myself behind. The person I had been before the encounter, the person who had loved this place, who had found peace here, was gone. In their place was someone new, someone scarred by fear and loss, someone who would never be the same. The lake had changed, and so had I. What was once a place of peace had become a site of nightmares, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of the world. And as I drove away, the memories of that night still fresh in my mind, I knew that no matter how far I went, I would never truly escape the horrors of the lake. They would follow me, haunting my thoughts, a constant reminder of the night I came face to face with something far beyond human understanding, and barely lived to tell the tale. The decision to leave the cabin and the lake for good wasn't an easy one, but it was inevitable. For as long as I could remember, the cabin had been my refuge, a place where I could escape the pressures of daily life, lose myself in the solitude of nature, and indulge in my love for fishing. The lake, with its calm waters and abundant fish, had been my sanctuary, a place of peace where the world seemed to slow down, allowing me to breathe, to think, and to find clarity. But after the encounter with the creature, everything changed. The lake, once a source of tranquility, had become a place of fear. The calm surface of the water now hid dark secrets, and the memories of that night, when I had come face to face with a horror beyond comprehension, tainted every aspect of the place I had once loved. The creature's presence, the way it had emerged from the depths and nearly taken my life, had shattered the illusion of safety that the lake and cabin had always provided. I knew I couldn't stay. The thought of spending another night in the cabin, alone and vulnerable, was unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the trees outside, would be a reminder of the terror I had faced. Even during the day, the lake's stillness would no longer bring comfort. Instead, it would fill me with dread, knowing what lay beneath its surface. The very idea of casting a line into those waters, of sitting in a boat surrounded by that dark, unknowable expanse, made my stomach twist with anxiety. As much as it pained me, I realized that my love for fishing, for the cabin, couldn't outweigh the fear that had taken root in my heart. I had to leave, not just for my own safety, but for my sanity. Staying would mean living in constant fear, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the creature to return. It would mean never finding peace, never being able to relax, always haunted by the memories of that night. The morning I decided to leave, the cabin felt different. The air inside was heavy, almost oppressive, as if the walls themselves were mourning my departure. I walked through the rooms, taking one last look at the place that had been my sanctuary for so long. The furniture, the fishing gear, the books on the shelves, everything seemed to carry a weight, a significance that I hadn't noticed before. These were the things that had defined my time here, the objects that had brought me comfort and joy. But now, they were reminders of what I had lost. Packing my belongings was a surreal experience. The items that I had once cherished felt distant, almost foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. My fishing gear, in particular, seemed to mock me, a reminder of the passion that had brought me here, now overshadowed by fear. Each rod, each lure, each piece of equipment felt like a relic of a past life, one that I could never return to. As I loaded the last of my things into the car, I took one final look at the lake. The water was calm, the surface smooth and unbroken, reflecting the clear sky above. It was hard to believe that something so terrifying could be hiding beneath such a peaceful exterior. But I knew the truth. I had seen it with my own eyes, felt its presence, heard its roars. The lake was no longer a friend, it was an enemy, a place of nightmares that I had to leave behind. Driving away from the cabin, I felt a profound sense of loss. I had come here so many times before, seeking solace, seeking peace. Now, I was leaving with a heavy heart, knowing that I would never return. The road ahead seemed uncertain, filled with questions that I couldn't yet answer. Where would I go? What would I do? How would I move forward from an experience that had shaken me to my core? The encounter with the creature had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. It had stripped away my sense of security, leaving me with a raw, unfiltered awareness of the world's dangers. It had forced me to confront the unknown, to face something that defied logic and reason. In doing so, it had made me realize how fragile we are, how easily the things we take for granted, peace, safety, sanity, can be shattered. But it had also taught me something about resilience. I had survived. I had faced the creature and lived to tell the tale, even if the experience had left scars, both physical and emotional. I knew that those scars would stay with me, a permanent reminder of what I had endured. The fear, the anxiety, the sense of vulnerability, they would never fully go away. But they were also a testament to my strength, to my ability to endure in the face of unimaginable horror. And yet, even as I drove away, putting miles between myself and the lake, I couldn't shake the lingering fear that the creature was still out there. The knowledge that something so ancient, so powerful, was lurking beneath the surface of that calm water filled me with a deep, abiding unease. What if it wasn't confined to the lake? What if it could find me, no matter where I went? The thought was almost too terrifying to consider, but it was a fear that I knew I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The lake, once a place of peace and solace, had become a site of nightmares. And as much as I wished I could forget, to move on and find new places to fish, new places to find peace, I knew that the memories of that night would haunt me forever. The creature might be gone, but its presence would linger in my mind, a shadow that I could never fully escape. As I left the cabin and the lake behind, I couldn't help but wonder if anyone else would ever discover the dark secrets hidden beneath those waters. Would the next person to find the cabin be as unsuspecting as I had been? Would they too come face to face with the creature? Or would the lake remain quiet, its secrets buried, until the next time it decided to rise? These were questions I couldn't answer. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, to find a new path forward, to rebuild my life away from the horrors of the lake. But no matter where I went, the memory of that night, and the creature that had nearly claimed me, would always be with me, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. This is where the story ends. Share your opinion in the comments. Did you like the story?